Um, Jonathan Skinner asked me to introduce Jeannette, believing that I know her quite well. We'll see if I pass. Um, Jeannette had took her undergraduate degree in history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro, uh, and went directly from there to join the Peace Corps, where she served in Iran from 1965 to 1967. She served in Noshar, which is on the Caspian Sea. And unfortunately, I never got to visit her there because I met her after she had left that town. And then she moved to Hamadan, which is in the Zagros Mountains to the west of Tehran. Um, and it was in that move that we actually met. Uh, and between those postings, Jeannette knew enough about Iran that she realized she needed an escort to tour the Tehran Bazaar. And someone in the Peace Corps office told her they'd seen me outside. That suggestion changed my life. We've been together ever since. Back in the US, um, uh, well, I should have added that what Jeannette did in Iran was basically to teach English as a second language. Although she tells very interesting stories about helping the staff at a fine restaurant on the Caspian identify the English words for all the things that they were serving, all of which, of course, they made sure that she got to taste. Um, but most of what she did there was to teach English to girls, kind of in what we'd call high school, I think. Um, Back in the U.S., her career was again mostly she was the aquatics director, award-winning aquatics director at the Jewish Community Center, and longtime Red Cross volunteer instructor and instructor training. And again, she was recognized with a number of awards for the work that she did for the Red Cross. Um, she became a member of the board of directors of the uh, Peace Corps Iran Association in 19 not 19 in 2024. um,
Oh dear, 2017.
2014. She became a member of the board in 2014.
Right.
Sorry, I was thinking of something else, which is actually one of our guests is one of the founders of that organization. Um, so Jeannette, you better be careful. Uh, and she's Jeanette's been president. We tried to figure out exactly when she became president, and we think it was 3 years ago in 2018. Um, and she's also much beloved by our Persian American friends for her command of Farsi and her hospitality. So, with that, and I can tell you that she has been delving into this book and what she's going to say for quite some time. So, Jeannette Gottlieb.
Thank you. Um, John Ghazvinian, well, as you know, the book is called America and Iran, 1720 to the Present by John Ghazvinian. John Ghazvinian is a historian and a former journalist, and the book reflects both of uh, these aspects of his careers. His research is well documented in meticulous detail. His writing style owes much to his journalist background. It's an enjoyable read. It's a story well told. And there are occasional phrases to surprise you, like perennial popinjay, Henry Kissinger. That one just popped out at me. In the book, Ghazvinian looks back at a much longer history of the engagement with Iran than most Americans realize. For some, our history with Iran began in 1979 but for others in 1953. But the reality is a fascination with Iran or Persia that began when there was no USA. Early newspapers in Boston and Philadelphia carried front page stories of events in Persia in the 1720s. They regularly published multiple pages about Persian affairs. The press at that time was passionately pro Iranian. From the early time, there were expectations and misunderstandings of what was happening in the Middle East. The big news event of the day was a rebellion against the Shah over forced conversions from Sunni to Shia Islam. The rebellion was interpreted in the colonies as being driven by the Ottoman Empire, that much hated enemy of Christendom. The reality was that the revolt arose out of the Persian Empire's Far East, current day Afghanistan. The Ottomans not only got in at the end of the story to prevent Russian encroachment. This thread of religious ideas mixing with politics runs throughout the history of our relations. It's not one that the author emphasizes, but it's there. What follows in the book is a fascinating report of the intersections, misunderstandings, missed opportunities, and misperceptions on both sides for 250 years. Ghazvinian states that beyond the evil Ottoman Empire, Persia was seen as a civilization that was less Muslim, less Arab, less evil, with a wise and enlightened Shah whose interests overlapped with America, a theme that echoed into the 20th century. On the other hand, Persian or Iranians were viewed the US as a neutral state, not trying to gain control over Iran and its resources. And I'm sorry. And as a shining example of a constitutional revolution that was done right. I apologize. My printer ran out of ink, and so I only had half a page. But what follows in the book are many, many stories outlining these intersections. And what I'd like to do is highlight a few of the ones that were my favorites. In the early 17 and 1800s, American children learned the ABCs from a rhyme that ended, or a rhyme in which X stood for Xerxes. And they knew who Xerxes was. It's sort of amazing to us to stop and think, but it was part of the cultural history and of the time, cultural literacy, that people knew Darius, Cyrus, and Xerxes. The next really interesting one was the Persian exhibit at the Chicago World's Fair in, I think it was 1895. It was a resounding success, but not because of what the Persians brought. They had gone all out. They brought priceless treasures, carpets. The list was huge. But some unknown person decided that in order to increase attendance, they should bring in belly dancers. So they hired a troupe. Well, they certainly got the attendance. It became the outstanding attraction of the fair. The Persian government was not amused. You do need to know that belly dancers were Arabic and not Persian. When the first American envoy arrived in Persia, he was met with an honor guard, a parade, very much pomp, and was taken for an immediate audience with the Shah. Persia's first ambassador to the US was met by an individual shuttled to a second-class hotel in New York and then taken to Washington. When he arrived in Washington, he had to wait to see the president. He was never able to deliver the letter from the Shah, as when he met the president, he was only in a receiving line. A major contrast in the way the diplomats were treated. The whole 19th century was filled with these episodes of ups and downs in relations. Even in the 20th century, even into the 20th century, most ambassadors were amateurs with no diplomatic skills or experience, and most did not last long. One was even found to be running a smuggling operation out of the embassy, not a very bright mark on America's work. The big plus in this scene were the Presbyterian missionaries, who from the 1830s until the early 1900s built schools, clinics, hospitals, churches, translated texts, printed books. They did not go to Iran to convert Muslims, as many might expect, but to bring a better way to the ancient Christian sects that inhabited northeastern Iran. Some of the oldest, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, those were the sects that were in northeastern Iran. The Presbyterians were very much esteemed, and their schools were very much respected. One young Presbyterian named Howard Baskerville became a hero and a martyr of the Constitutional Revolution in 1900. He is basically unknown in the US, but he is still honored even in the Islamic Republic for his sacrifice for Iran. The Constitutional Revolution also brought another very interesting American to Iran. In the 20s, 1910, the Majlis made a formal request to the US for a financial advisor and to help stabilize the currency. Iran had a lot of problems. We had shahs who spent lavishly. We had Russia and Britain splitting up the country and taking most of the money that we had. There's a very funny paragraph about how all kinds of foreign powers dipped their fingers in the treasury. So W. Morgan Schuster was sent on the recommendation of President Taft. He was actually hired by the Persian government. So he was not considered an American diplomat. And he only lasted 7 months, but he had a huge impact in bringing a lot of control into the financial situation. The only problem was that he fell victim to the great game between Britain and Russia when Russia realized he was being effective. Russia sent troops into Iran and demanded that Schuster be fired. The Majlis sent an appeal to the US for help, but their appeal unfortunately was met in Congress with laughter because they sent the appeal in French. And most of the people in Congress couldn't understand. Quoting Ghazvinian, at the most crucial hour, Persia's plucky little democratic movement reached out to the US hoping for some expression of solidarity and received no response. That was not the first, nor was it the last time the Persian government requested aid from the US and received no response. The 20th century is filled with aspirations on the part of Iran to become recognized as a nation in control of its own destiny and to rid itself of foreign influence and control. It came close to achieving that dream in 1952-53. Again, it was a victim of the Great Game when the US sided with the British and not the constitutional government of Iran. I think I said the Great Game was the struggle of the European powers to control the rest of the world. And Iran, because of its situation, was always a pawn, and there was a tug of war between Russia and Britain throughout the 1900s and well into the 20th century. The Reza Shah came to power in the vacuum that was left after the Russians ousted Schuster, which eventually led to the total fall of the Majlis, and once again, Russia and Britain controlling who was in the government. He basically was a very cruel tyrant. He ruled by intimidation. And although the seeds of the struggle between the clergy and the Shahs were sown in the 19th century, they were really heightened under Reza Shah. He had an emphasis on a secular Iran. He harked back to the Persian Empire, and both he and his son imprisoned and tortured members of the clergy who might have threatened their power. The last 75 years of the book were the hardest to read for me. I lived them. In college, I studied the overthrow of Mossadegh in '53, reading many of the original newspaper and magazine reports of his visit to the UN. It was clear that the US press ridiculed him as an old man. They spoke of his pajamas as though they were bedclothes rather than traditional Iranian dress. Ghazvinian makes the same mistake in one place. In the 60s, I served in Iran. Peace Corps volunteers saw positive things that the Shah did for the country, like clean water, a health corps, and a teachers corps. We also knew or were told of the repression practiced against any dissent. Savak, the Shah's secret police, was hated and was always watching. People disappeared. Some of us were quietly told how much the Shah and his family were disliked, and America was admired. But on special occasions, no matter how much they disliked the Shah, everyone turned out to shout, Shah and Shah Ayamer, King of Kings, Light of the Aryans, because Savak was watching. US complacency with the Shah led it to ignore many warning signs of the dissent, which culminated in 1978. In the 1970s, with the glut of oil money, the number of foreigners in the country swelled. Many Americans exhibited little or any cultural sensitivity, which led to backlash from conservative elements. Ghazvinian offers a detailed look at the checkered history of relations since 1979. The hostage crisis, Iran-Contra, the long, deadly Iran-Iraq war, and the US-Israel arms sales to Iran. The nuclear crisis, which is based on misinformation. Iran's cooperation with the US against al-Qaeda and ISIS, followed by US snubs. Offers to negotiate by Iran also snubbed. Netanyahu's manipulation of US politics to obtain sanctions on Iran. Missteps on both sides, the light at the end of the tunnel under Obama and the JCPOA, and the whiplash of Trump sanctions. What is clear is that Iran never intended to build a nuclear bomb. Both Khomeini and Khamenei have issued fatwas against them and all weapons of mass destruction as un-Islamic. And scientists, the AEA, and intelligence agencies have confirmed that. What is unclear is if there is any way to overcome the corrosive rhetoric and mistrust. Ghazvinian points out that sanctions will not bring regime change, as people who perceive themselves to be under threat from a foreign power will not generally turn against their leaders. However much Iranians may resent their politicians, they resent foreign interference in their affairs more. And I would happily take questions from anyone.
Hi. It's less a question than an observation, but the last thing you said, I'm not, obviously, I just know this stuff from just reading the newspapers, but it seems that it's always the case that we think that we understand what whoever they are, whether it's Iran or someone else, does better than they know themselves. That the people are going to rise up against the current regime because economics, the sanctions are having a terrible effect on the people, and they don't seem to understand this. And so how is it that we have people, diplomats and other people, who don't seem to be giving the right guidance to this country to respond to those countries in a way that is much more realistic?
I wish I knew, but it certainly runs all through this book. And if you look at what's happening currently, we have people who are actively working against Biden in his efforts to bring the JCP, the US back into compliance with the JCPOA, which would be a much better situation all the way around for both Iran and the US. A lot of it, which also shows up in this book, is economic interests. We went with the oil companies rather than the aspirations of the Iranian people in the 50s. And we went with arms sales. Probably the Peace Corps was one of the better foreign policy moves in Iran. I do know that there are really dedicated people who give good advice, but I think there's a lot of political maneuvering that negates that good advice.
If I could add to what Jeannette said, Obama had his Iran desk run by a former Peace Corps volunteer who was also one of the hostages, and yet looked at what was going on in a totally pragmatic, how do we improve the future way. So it's not continuous, but there is a group of Americans that don't want to see it that way. And there is a literature, I don't remember if Jeannette mentioned something about it, but there's also a literature about how our view of Iran gets mixed up in Israeli American politics. Because after, there's a book by Trita Farsi, which I think is a beautiful book, that talks about the fact that after we defeated Iraq, Israel needed an enemy.
Iraq, it was Iraq.
Yes, that's what I thought I said that. After the US defeated Iraq, Israel needed an enemy and chose Iran, and has sort of pushed very hard with its contacts in the United States. So there's a lot of domestic politics that's affecting American views of Iran for reasons that have little to do with actually understanding what's going on over there.
Can I ask some questions?
Sure.
Oh, I'm hoping you can hear me. I actually have three questions. I think two of them will be fairly quick. One of them is that would you recommend reading this book as a way of combating one's ignorance of what's going on over there?
Absolutely.
The second one, yeah. Okay. The second question is: am I right in thinking that Iran or Persia was never actually part of the Ottoman Empire, but it ended up being sort of in between what was the sort of the Greater India and the Ottoman Empire?
Yes.
Yeah, and
the Persian Empire and what is modern day has expanded and contracted over the centuries, but it was never part of the Ottoman Empire, and much to Britain's chagrin, it never became part of the British Empire, try as they might.
Yeah, I was going to say that every Iranian that I've ever talked with has somehow managed to say somewhere in the conversation that the coup that was inspired by the hatred of Mossadegh was something they all remember. But the third question I have is that, right now we're in the middle of a pandemic, which is actually in its scope not too different from the one of 1918. I was wondering if the book ever makes any references to that flu pandemic of 100 years ago.
No, it doesn't. What struck Iran at that point was there was a great famine. Iran was neutral during the First World War, but was not treated that way. And what happened was a famine that killed an enormous number of Iranians because of sanctions.
Yeah, that's interesting.
More than the flu. More than the flu.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a very fine book about the pandemic called Pale Rider by a European journalist named Laura Spinney, who specializes in scientific research. And she actually includes in her book stories about what happened all over the world instead of just what's happened in, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and the Western Front. And one of her stories is actually about a village in Iran, which was devastated by the pandemic. So, I mean, that's not to take it away from what you were saying about the famine, because there's no reason why you can't have both a famine and a plague at the same time and have one of them be, worse than the other. I'm not meaning to disagree with you about that.
Oh, no, I'm not disagreeing at all. In fact, I'd have to go back and look. When you read a book with this much information and in-depth information, sometimes something like the flu may not pop out as much as the starvation of the famine did. And there are several mentions of the book of illnesses sweeping parts of the country. That was one of the things that endeared the Presbyterians because of their clinics and their hospitals. They were able to save so many people.
I should also say thank you for doing an interesting review.
Yeah. Are there, does anybody else have questions? I mean, I can bring up all kinds of examples from the book. I highly recommend the book. It's easy reading. It's divided into 4 sections. For whatever reason, Ghazvinian calls them by the seasons: spring, summer, fall, and winter. Winter, of course, being since 1979. But he had access to a lot of archives in Iran and also American archives. I found actually reading his footnotes almost as interesting as reading the book. But the other piece of it is the book is very readable. You know, sometimes history is, you have to sort of slog through it. But this history is very readable. The people come through very clearly, both the Iranians and the Americans in their interactions. And it's just full of wonderful, wonderful stories.
I have a question of you specifically. What did you, when 1979 happened, November, what did you think based on what you already knew about the place? How did you react to this based on the knowledge that you had of the area, and subsequently have you thought about that time?
I thought that I was not surprised that there was a revolution. The Shah had become more and more paranoid, and the disparity between the poor and the way the Shah was spending money was very clear. I also wasn't surprised that the clergy took over, that it was centered around the clergy. One of the things that we saw even in the mid-60s was that as young Iranian men left their village and went into the larger cities to looking for work, and often ended up maybe finding it or not. But what happened was a total dislocation because the society was very much family oriented and very much a part of your village was a part of your life and your grounding. And the one constant was the mosque. And so that was where people gravitated, these young men gravitated when they were in the city for some kind of anchor, because they did not have the family or anything else familiar. And the other thing is that, as I mentioned in the review, there was a backlash against this enormous influx of foreigners who came in during the oil glut in the 70s. And I've had other Peace Corps volunteers who served in the 70s tell me about women walking around in short shorts and halters and things that were totally anathema to the traditional society. Just no respect for the society. And I was told of an incident in which a couple of Americans rode motorcycles into a mosque. These are not things that are respectful of another person's country or society. And there was a lot of that, and there was a real backlash among the more conservative Iranians. And my feeling since, I am not a fan of the Ayatollahs. I really feel that the Iranian people are repressed in many ways. But I also think that, as many Iranian governments before, that they are highly pragmatic, that what they do to hold on to power, and that it's very difficult for us to conceive of a government that is split between a theocracy that is governed by a ruling council who has the ultimate say, but also a legislature which oversees government on a daily basis, and also a country which has an army and a navy, but also has the Iranian Guard, which is sort of a separate army that's under the theocracy. And I think it's also very difficult to negotiate with such a country.
Jeanette, one of the questions you were asked was about your reactions to what was going on when we were over there. Did the rest of the U.S. government or the Peace Corps figure out that the revolution was coming first?
A lot of the Peace Corps volunteers figured out that something was going to blow. Remember, it was the Peace Corps volunteers who told the U.S. government to terminate Peace Corps in Iran.
3 years before the revolution.
3 years before the revolution.
But it was never directed against the Peace Corps volunteers themselves. I don't think we
No.
were ever in danger.
No. As far as I know, Peace Corps volunteers were very well liked, and they are well remembered. We have people in our group who are being contacted now by former students. Now that we have a website and pages, I think there are people who stayed in Iran, not as Peace Corps volunteers, but they were former volunteers who stayed in Iran, lived through the revolution in their villages, and were just fine.
I have a very simple question. How many people are there in Iran?
I can't tell you. I'd have to Google it.
Maybe I should do that.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's not like the size of Vermont or even
Oh,
the
no.
size
Oh,
of
no.
California. It's a big country, right?
Iran is as big as, or slightly bigger than the United States east of the Mississippi.
That you mean geographically?
Geographically.
Yeah.
It's a very large country. It's a diverse country. It has a very proud history, and the people despite the fact that there are tribes and everything else, that there are tribal groups and different ethnic groups in Iran, there is an Iranian nationalism that runs through the people. And it's one of the ways, despite the sanctions, Iran has survived. It has been difficult. One of the big problems with the getting their nuclear fuel and the fuel enrichment, most of it is going to the hospitals for treating cancer patients. And It's hard for me to describe it, but if you stop and think about how you feel as an American, even if you don't like the government, you still have this, or I have this feeling that for all the problems that we have, I'm an American. The Iranians have the same feeling towards their country. And one of the issues that brought about the revolution was, if you can stop and think about, say, a city that went from a couple 100,000, say when we were there, to 20 million in a little over 10 years, or a little over 10 years. You can imagine how much dislocation took place for that kind of a population surge in Tehran in 10 years.
John, there's about 85 million people in Iran.
Yes.
I did look it up.
Well, thank you.
According to the CIA fact book, which is one of my favorite sources of this sort of stuff.
Uh-huh.
Okay, I have a question on chat. I don't have a good handle on the timeline about change in U.S. attitude before the hostages. According to Ghazvinian, there were some tentative outreach. And Carter actually knew that he was going to have a major problem on his hand by when he allowed the Shah into the US for medical treatment. And that's what triggered the hostage crisis, which got out of hand. There had actually been an attack on the US embassy earlier, before the hostage crisis, and the Ayatollah had stepped in and quashed it. He did not step in and quash the hostage crisis for a whole slew of political reasons. And I view the chanting crowds in Iran who go out and chant "Death to America" very much like I viewed the ones that went out and chanted "Shah and Shah al-Yamir." The army or the political activists go out and round them up and say, "Time to go out and chant," and out and chant they go, and then they go home and have dinner. That's not to say that during the revolution, those weren't angry mobs, but I'm saying that when you see these chanting mobs now that get a lot of play, they're very much like the same ones that went out and shouted for the Shah before. It's a way of life. I would invite anyone who is interested to look at the website of our organization, the Peace Corps Iran Association. It's peacecorpsiran.org. We are mainly all returned volunteers, but we welcome anyone who has a serious interest. an understanding of Iran. And what we do is work for better understanding between the Iranian people and the American people. Not between our governments necessarily. We do have an advocacy group who advocates for diplomacy and peace. Um, do I have any other questions?
Actually, if you don't mind my asking another sort of historical question.
Sure.
My first contact with knowing anything about Persia was reading Herodotus, whose book, which has the Greek title, which means inquiries, sometimes has its English title as the Persian Wars. And I was wondering if there's any connection between that and what's in this book.
No, he doesn't mention Herodotus. He really is concentrating on the U.S. and Iran. However, having mentioned that, the literate people would have studied Herodotus, and part of what led to the cultural literacy was that the education system covered the Persian Empire in the same way that it covered the Roman and the Greek empires in those early years. Also, a lot of what Americans knew in the early part in the 1700s was from British travelers who visited Iran and wrote about it. The other group of people that Americans who interacted with the Iranians in the early days that I didn't mention were the rum traders. They sold Boston particular to the Iranians, which was rum laced with whiskey, and did a booming business with Iran, even though Islam prescribes alcohol.
Did you learn to pour salt in your beer over there?
Yes.
Yep. And we were also handed Iranian wine.
I have a broader question. What is it about the Peace Corps ethos, I guess, that is so good at understanding the world in a way that lots of people don't?
Peace Corps approaches our ethos is a people to people, and it's we get, or we did, and from my understanding is people get a thorough grounding cultural background. There's a cultural respect that is built into each assignment. You go. Now, we were part of the period when we were supposed to export American exceptionalism, but all of us still got a thorough grounding in the background of the country, the culture, and we were expected to be respectful of that culture and to learn to live in the culture. I guess that's the big thing, is all of us lived in that culture. We didn't live in American compounds. Often there were only one or two of us in an area. Sometimes we lived together. Sometimes we were alone. So we were living directly with the people. and interacting and being part of their lives. And it makes a big difference.
I think it's also worth commenting that Iran has been the recipient of refugees for thousands of years. I mean, the story of that is told in the Bible with respect to the destruction of the Jewish temple and the migration of the people to Iran and then being allowed to rebuild by Cyrus. But there are Turks in there. There are all kinds of groups of people that have come to Iran as refugees. Some of them in the Second World War, who came for safety in Iran. And I'm not just talking about Jews. I'm talking about various groups of Eastern Europeans, for example. So in that sense, Iran also is a fairly diverse country. And one of the interesting things about, when Jeannette was describing Iran as less Arab, less Muslim, I forget what the third less was. But one of the classics of Iranian literature is something called the Book of Kings, the Shahnameh. And what that's about is to try to hold on to its pre-Islamic culture. So there is a seed of truth in that characterization, actually.
Anyone else have questions or comments or?
All right. Somebody asked for our website. Steve, can you type it into the chat, please? Just the Peace Corps.
You better tell
Iran.
me if I get it right.
PeaceCorpsIran.org.
Okay.
I really appreciate your asking me to read and review the book. It might have taken me a while to get around to it. And as one of the New York Times reviewers pointed out, it may be to the present, but his present was 2017 because of the timeline, the time gap between finishing writing and getting a book published. But it is still an extremely timely book for understanding American-Iranian relations.
I should mention that Gene Dam deserves the credit for having arranged for you to participate and give this nice talk. He can't be here because he's working today.
Good for him.
Well, he's probably working the polls.
No, actually, he's working at the public schools. So.
Ah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I appreciate that. I will thank Jane.
I want to thank you for speaking, and I'll even thank Stephen for his great introduction and his comments.
You got two for the price of one.
Yeah, we're blessed. Well, I guess that's it then. Unless you have some final words.
My final words would be, please read the book, and particularly the latter part of it, to understand the intertwining of other countries into the Iran and American interaction. Israel's role since the 1990s is just astounding how much they've manipulated our foreign policy.
It's also astounding because they had a very good relationship, the two countries, before the Iraq War. I was in, people argue with me, I call it the embassy. Everybody else wants to say it was only a consulate. But I was in the Israeli embassy in Tehran. And it was one of the questions that I asked before accepting the assignment to Tehran. As a Jew, am I going to be safe over there? And they came back and said, you know, Israel and Iran have a good relationship. And they did. I stayed with a Persian host family. And Hassan was an agricultural engineer. He'd studied in England, but he'd also studied in Israel. And we listened to the BBC together during the '67 war. And his feelings were torn because he says, you know, I'm a Muslim, but you got to give credit to the Israelis. That's not his words, but that was the point, that he had a lot of respect for Israel in standing up against 6 hostile neighbors in that war. So it not to say that there weren't mullahs that were anti-Semitic in different ways. I encountered somebody who was surprised that I didn't have horns. But it was a good relationship, and then it turned sour.
Mm.
And I also knew a lot of Iranian Jews. Went to High Holy Day services in Shiraz, where I was living. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, then. Well, thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you for having us, having Jeannette.
Yes. Jackie's applauding.
Oh.
I could see her applauding. I can't hear her.
Great.
I'm actually calling in from Portland, Oregon.
Yes.
And I'm a board member with Jeannette on the Peace Corps Iran Association. So that's how I know Jeannette. But since I'm speaking right now, let me say that I was a librarian for 35 years until I retired recently, and in public libraries in Southwest Washington, which is a suburban part of Portland. And I am so impressed that your Friends of the Library do this great program. This is just wonderful. And I think I'll tell some of the friends that I still know in Vancouver, Washington about this.
Oh, please
And,
do.
yeah, great job. And good job, Jeannette, too. Very nicely done.
All right.
Okay. Well, thank you all.
And thank you again.
Where is the? Please put
Is off.